3 weeks on, I'm still filled with rage, but when it roils near the surface, its bubbles pop pathetically, hissing, nothing will change. Instead, my friends and my family will leave. My colleagues, neighbors, interview subject, exes, favorite shopkeepers, my rivals and my inspirations will either be forced to emigrate or be so exhausted by trying to exist that their light will simply perish. It is this that pushes me every day to tears. In August 2020, Maya wrote these words, an ode to Lebanon, then developed them and published them as a blog a year later with the appropriate title, The Lights. It basically focused on Lebanon post the port explosion a year on. Now, I shall include this short piece, the link, in the description box of this episode so people can access it. Meanwhile, to everybody viewing me today in this episode, welcome to Intuitive Reactions, the MENA and Gulf regions. Today, with this episode, I'm going to head to Iraq and Lebanon. But it is not me and my own perceptions or experiences that will be talking. Rather, it's Maya's experiences, her lens, her prism. Maya Gebeily was a reporter for Agence France Presse, AFP, in Baghdad and Beirut for some 6 years before moving to Thomson Reuters Foundation as their Middle East correspondent earlier this year. It is in this context that I invited Maya today for a brief conversation about her comparative comments. I think it's quite interesting, snippets, comments on Iraq and Lebanon, two failing states, not yet failed, perhaps more because of the determination and will of its peoples who still valiantly struggle on today. Maya has lived in Baghdad. She's been across Iraq. She's lived and lives in Beirut. She's been across the Lebanon. So it would be quite interesting, I think, to get her viewpoint on what is it about Lebanon and Iraq that most Europeans, politicians, as well as ordinary observers and analysts would say, oh yes, forget both countries. How and why? So welcome to all of this, Maya. And I'm going to start straight on with the first question. Tell me the similarities between the two countries. You've seen Iraq, you've seen Lebanon. Are there similarities?
It's a great question, Harry. And first of all, thank you so much for hosting me. It's an excellent question because it's something that really smacked me in the face as soon as I arrived in Iraq, was just how similar it was to Lebanon and how much more I could understand Iraq and understand what was happening politically, socially, economically, even because of my experience as a Lebanese. And the reverse is also true. When I returned to Lebanon in March, when I returned to a Lebanon that had undergone an economic crisis in my absence, the social situation had deteriorated greatly, the service situation had deteriorated greatly. I could really dissect the root causes and the impacts so much more clearly and so much and with such kind of with so much more experience having lived in Iraq and having seen what it was like there as well. So it's with great sadness that I say that. I mean, I wish it was not the case, and I wish that the similarities were not so negative, but they unfortunately are. So if I'm going to kind of step back and try to speak analytically about why they're so similar, we can start with the root causes. In the aftermath of both the Lebanese civil war and the US invasion of Iraq, the political systems that were put in place were ones that were not interested in building countries in a sustainable way. What was really important in both countries, living both after these kind of shock factors, the invasion and the civil war, was to get the country up and running as quickly as we possibly could. So that means, lay down some concrete, throw some buildings up. Let's try to get things moving and get people back to work and get people back to life. And unfortunately, what that means is that years down the line in both of these countries, you don't have accessible healthcare systems. You don't have sustainable public transport. You don't have institutions that are really built for the people. And at various points, there have been stressors in the past couple of years for both of these countries that have really brought to light just how unsustainable and how inequitable these systems are in each of these countries. What has happened in the aftermath as well has really shown us the political practices that were put into place in both countries, which again, it breaks my heart to say are unfortunately very similar, where you've got corrupt political elites, many of them with allies or themselves with arms and with access to weapons, who have control of state resources. We're talking jobs, we're talking public contracts, we're talking even access to public institutions that they dole out based on their political alliances or their political interests. And that leaves a majority of the population that has very little access to these resources. And this is the reality that we're seeing in both countries today. In Lebanon, in a much more severe way because of the economic crisis. But it's really important not to look at the crisis that is unfolding in Lebanon, continues to unfold, as one that is independent of its politics. It isn't. It is one that has been that unfortunately has come to light and has been spurred on by the political system that was put in place, that was not building a country sustainably. So it does indeed break my heart to say that these are countries that are experiencing very similar political and economic catastrophes because of the systems that have been put in place over the last 20 to 30 years in each one.
Okie doke. Now, you've pointed out the severe similarities in both countries that you clearly like a lot, because in those few minutes, your heart was broken 2-3 times already, Maya.
Indeed.
So if we try and shift the pendulum a little and say, okay, there are similarities. You've given a lot of food for thought for people listening and viewing this episode. What are the dissimilarities, the differences, if there are any?
There are, and I think the first one that we can start with, Harry, is the most obvious, which is that Iraq has a safety net that Lebanon does not have access to. Iraq has oil. Iraq is continuing to sell its oil, and Iraq is continuing to depend on those oil sales for more than 90% of its state resources. And as long as Iraq has that, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It, on the one hand, means that it still has access to dollars. It's able to sell that oil for dollars and able to bring in that foreign currency into its economy. But on the other hand, it has a buffer that makes many Iraqi leaders, financial and political, uninterested and kind of unpressured to implement reforms to make its economy much more sustainable and much more forward-looking. So it has this kind of this safety net that at the same time is hampering its progress into a sustainable economy. Lebanon does not have that safety net, and because it lacks that safety net, it tumbled very, very quickly in the past 2 years into the economic crisis that we're seeing today, where you've got more than 3/4 of the population living beneath the poverty line. You've got many that are not able to send their kids to school. You've got a 7-fold increase in child labor just since April. I mean, that's what, 8 months since April. So it really, I mean, when I say my heart is breaking, you can understand why I continue to repeat that phrase, because it really is every day a new type of heartbreak here. So we do have dissimilarities. I think what Lebanon does have that Iraq possibly doesn't is a very, very high level of engagement from the diaspora. We're really seeing that come to light ahead of the parliamentary elections that we hope will be held next year, where there is a very significant political engagement coming from abroad that we are hoping will spur some kind of balance of power that will lead to a more sustainable political system.
Okay, time will tell whether that will be true or not, I think, Maya. But you've spoken about similarities and dissimilarities, and I agree with you entirely about that. And one big dissimilarity also is that just over a year ago in Lebanon, in Beirut, you had that awful, dreadful port explosion, which still has not been accounted for. Whereas in Iraq, you talked about elections. In Iraq, they have had elections, and for the last so many long weeks, they're quibbling about whether those elections are valid or not. But let's leave similarities and dissimilarities and let people draw their own conclusions from what you've just said. Let me quickly finish off by asking you about this famous tunnel of mine. Does this tunnel, either for Iraq or for Lebanon, have any light at its end, any hope for either or both countries from your own experiences and contacts? Or in the words of your blog that I referred to in the intro, does the flame burn any brighter today? What are your thoughts, Maya?
It's the trickiest question you've asked so far, Harry, because I'm of two minds. Personally, I would really love to think that there's a lot to be hopeful for. I would love to look at the awareness that has been exhibited in Iraq and especially in Lebanon over the past 2 years, and say that public awareness, that unprecedented ability to diagnose where the problem lies and to really speak out and name names and point to politicians and decisions that led us to this crisis. I would love to say that awareness is enough to take each country forward into a new era. But at the same time, I know that age-old characteristic that has always been slapped onto Lebanon, that we're resilient, that we're a resilient people. Unfortunately, I find that the political class is much more resilient possibly than the people. That's what I'm deeply, deeply afraid of, that we'll see next year in both Lebanon and Iraq, that the architects of these political decisions over the past 20 to 30 years know how to get themselves out of this crisis relatively unscathed. So I'm of two minds. I can't, the kind of the optimist in me and the person who is from the region really wants to believe that things will change. And kind of stepping back and looking analytically as a journalist, I find it quite difficult to see exactly where the opening lies. So as you said, time will tell, and we'll have to wait until a government is formed in Iraq. We'll have to wait until hopefully elections are held in Lebanon to see what happens next.
You know what, Maya, you talked about pessimism and optimism. I'd refer you to Emil Habibi, the Palestinian novelist, who coined the word pesoptimism and threw both in it, or to one of your former politicians in Lebanon, Ghassan Salami, who used the word, which I thought was quite nice, un pessimiste actif, an active pessimist, which I thought was quite nice. Listen, I've got 30 seconds, literally, and I'm going to throw in a quick question that doesn't really need analysis, just a factual response. COVID-19, here in the UK and in Europe, we're already panicking with the Omicron new variant. What about Lebanon and Iraq? How is the situation health-wise, COVID-wise at your end?
Certainly in Lebanon, the cases are on the rise and there's some serious concerns. And what that just means is it's compounding all the other crises that are unfolding here. So there's concerns that schools will not be able to reopen next year because of possible rising cases, and that just puts further strain on parents, on job holders, etc. In Iraq, I don't have the updated figures just yet, but I imagine it's a similar situation, and it's just further exacerbating the crises that are already unfolding in each of these countries. So we have cause for concern in both, certainly.
I admire you. I thought journalists and politicians never said, I don't know, but you just said it. So all credit to you, Maya.
I wouldn't lie to you, Harry. I wouldn't lie to
you. All credit to you. And thank you very much for this very short set of snippets that will be viewed by politicians and ordinary people alike. Listen, you take care of yourself and enjoy Lebanon as much as you can. In some way, I still envy you.
Thanks so much, Harry. Thanks. And you're welcome to visit anytime. You know that.
Thank you. Or as they say, shukran. Take care.
Take care.